I find it extremely exciting to be at a time where chaos is all around, but everything else can be built. Everything else can be reinvented and recreated. Not saving the planet. The planet is going to do very, very well without us. I'm trying to save ourselves.
In this episode, I'm asking a regular COP attendant if these conferences are basically a big waste of money or what needs to change that they work. And we're figuring out whether or not the narrative that we hear from the media is what's really happening on the ground. So this is Life in Plastic with Loreley Picourt. Hi, Loreley. Thank you so much for taking the time today.
Hi, Joel. Very pleased to be here.
Yeah. You basically just returned from COP30 in Belém. Can you tell me how it is when you are there in person and see and feel and listen to all the conversations versus what's then filtered through into the media? Is there a mismatch or is it pretty much correct?
Well, whether it's Belém or any COP international conference, it does feel hectic because there are thousands of people running around in a hurry, going to events. There's such a big emulation of knowledge and a lot of enthusiasm, surprisingly, especially in the pavilions where projects are being featured, conversations are being held. So that's the beating heart of the COPs. And of course, you have the negotiations where you have the tough conversations happening and the multilateralism at its best. What I feel when I go to COP is, well, first of all, always very excited because it feels like at least for 2 weeks, it's the heart of the world where we're talking about climate change, biodiversity. We may disagree, and as you know, many countries do, but at least it's happening and it's happening before us. We sometimes feel extremely powerless because of the lack of influence that civil society can have on these negotiations. Sometimes we feel energized when we hear new coalitions, new projects, more money on the table. It's a lot of mixed feelings condensed in 2 weeks. And in Belém, it was especially important for me to be there because it's the 10th year anniversary of the Paris Agreement. That's 10 years ago. That's when the ocean was first recognized, included in the Paris Agreement. So it was very important to show for that as well, a decade later, to share that progress, to show that we're moving forward, and to be in Belém in both the heart of the Amazon, but also in the gateway to the Atlantic. It felt very symbolic to be in the middle of nature because it was so important for this COP specifically to place nature back at the heart of the climate negotiations. So it was quite exciting, and we made it through floods, fires, and humidity. I have to say, we made it 2 weeks in Belém.
It's fantastic. And I mean, the way that I read the media is that it was basically yet another failure because the world didn't change within 2 weeks. How do you look back? And specifically also, how do you look forward?
Honestly, I'm not surprised that that's what you hear in the media. Quite frankly, that's what we hear every year. We have 2 weeks to save the world. And no, we have 2 weeks to remove a large number of brackets from the document. So sometimes it's important to set the record straight, but as well about what these international negotiations are about. Of course, and I'm sure we'll get into it, the threats to multilateralism, the threats to science, the threats to collaboration in general are weighing on the atmosphere, on the negotiations, and on COPs overall. But ultimately, these formats, they may need to be reinvented, but they do serve a purpose. And whether we succeed or we fail at securing some specific outcomes, it is important to have this space in the world once a year to convene all stakeholders from countries that are facing the imminent impacts of climate change to the ones that are responsible for most of the impacts that we're facing today, but also the diversity of the community in its entirety. And that's something that was very powerful in Belém, both from the side of having an increasing number of indigenous people and local communities being invited into the climate COPs. Still not enough, especially when you compare this with the number of fossil fuel lobbyists that were actually part of the negotiations. So that's part of the frustration, of course. But we need also to make these conversations that are taking place inside the COPs a lot more accessible, because it does feel like an ivory tower where dynamics of power and influence are at play, which it is. But how do we translate the real outcomes, the real setbacks as well of these international conferences, so that it doesn't simply fuel the narrative in the media that we are once again failing and simply translating some of the symbolic rather than the actual content of these conferences.
And I mean, one big topic, at least for me, before COP was this shifting narrative around climate. It feels like it's not that much of a priority anymore. Bill Gates released this long article. I read it through to roughly 50%, so I don't want to quote anything from it. And I have to be honest, when I read it, I wasn't shocked. I was more almost positively surprised, because he pointed out a couple of actually quite positive trends. How do you see this narrative shift personally?
Of course, I'm French, I'm based in France. We see the narrative shift in the national, but also in the global political landscape. And it's true that, and it's funny because I was having this conversation last night with some colleagues who are about 2 decades older than me, and they had lost faith, and they were seeing me all enthusiastic and saying, no, we can still fight. So it's also a generation debate, I feel, but it's, of course, we can't deny that whether it's the climate conversation or the biodiversity conversation in general, it is losing traction in the public debates. There is a lot of insecurities, there are global wars, there's a lot of other topics that are occupying our minds. And in this transformation, in this shift in the narrative, what I see most is the opportunity for us to reinvent ourselves as well, because we can't polarize environmental issues. It's not a matter of left or right. It's not a matter of rich and poor, although it is in many, many aspects of the way the issue translates. It's so cross-cutting that I feel civil society, especially NGOs that do a lot of advocacy, we have a role to play in making that narrative evolve and reinventing ourselves to some extent. For instance, how do you talk about protecting nature to match the security discourse that's happening at the moment? Instead of talking about the amount of lands or amount of ecosystems being degraded, how do you link this with human lives? How do you link this with the populations being displaced from their homes? And how do you make sure that your story is relevant to the people in front of you? Because if we have changes in the people in office, we need to be able to safeguard some of the work that we've been doing for decades, but also make sure that we don't talk at the public, but really with them, and encourage that dialogue to meaningfully hear some of those concerns and respond in the most appropriate way to not only respect some of the views that you may hear, but also being able to provide a bit of hope and some solutions. And that's a big part of our work with the Ocean and Climate Platform, is to not only see the ocean as a victim of climate change, but also a powerful part of the solution. And the solutions that we have, they are science-based, they exist, they can be scaled, and they're relevant for the conversation about decarbonization. For instance, when we talk about offshore wind energy or the decarbonization of the shipping industry, of course, phasing out offshore oil and gas, but it's also relevant to the blue economy discussion, for instance. We're talking about creating jobs, about sustaining livelihoods, and making sure that well-being and care are part of the conversation as we transform our socioeconomic systems.
Yeah, and I think this is a macro trend that I've also observed over the past 6 years. Basically, in the early 2020s, it was all about the environment, and we're harming the environment. And somehow we've gotten, or I'm not even sure if we've gotten more egoistic or if we've just gotten more honest, that in the end, what humans care about is ourselves, right? Or I can't say that for every single person in the world, but it feels like the entire sustainability narrative is becoming more and more personal. And I was having a quite funny conversation yesterday with someone on reducing plastic waste. And he said to me, you can't, how to say this in a nice way, you can't poo in the water and drink it. And this is what we basically do with plastic pollution. So everything that we consume as humans goes back into the cycle, and we bring it back into nature, and then we take it in again. And I think this is where it becomes personal with the oceans. Or how do you see the ocean fitting into this entire conversation?
Well, to your first comment, I want to say that, of course, I mean, the whole ecosystem is extremely complex, but so are human beings, and we all live with our controversies as well. And to give you a very simple example, I work and run an organization that protects the ocean against climate change. Right, my carbon footprint is off the charts, because I go to these international conferences to be that voice and to make sure that we're not completely sidetracked or sidelined in the international conversations. But the reality of it is also me being on a plane all the time, which is something that is profoundly controversial with regards to the work that I do. And I know these are the limits of our campaigning. But when we see that we have a very proactive ocean community, I have to say the ocean community is one of the most inspiring ones I've had the opportunity to work with, but it's also very few of us. You can count it in terms of dozens of people, which explains why also so many of us have to travel halfway across the globe all the time. But there is some rationality to have with this as well. We don't need to be at all conferences, and that's where we need to be a bit more strategic in our way to influence, I think. But the plastic debate is always an interesting one, because I don't work on plastic, so I don't know the details of the negotiations. But a very simple thing for me is that if you do not want plastic in your ocean, you have to stop producing plastic. That's the only thing. You can try and clean up the ocean as much as you want. The only way to stop this crisis is by stop producing plastic on land. And most people will tell you it's impossible. In today's realities, it's very difficult indeed. But we used to say the same thing about many other issues that we've ultimately managed to get under control. And my favorite example, which is one of probably the most successful multilateral environmental agreements of all times, is the Montreal Protocol, to reduce the impacts and reduce the hole in the ozone. It was less complex than climate change because it was targeting some specific CFCs, and we managed to put a cap on it. Of course, it took years of negotiations, and it took many different stakeholders, countries, of course, but also the businesses as well as civil society. And we managed to find a way to work together. And industries found a way and an alternative to CFCs that they could commercialize. And very, very quickly, as soon as this was done, we saw progress. So I think the human instinct is always to say it's too complicated, we'll never manage. But then you have a few bunch of crazy people who still try. And that's where I find my hope. And we do see stories of progress. And one of the, for me, striking conclusions of COP30 is that if we are to truly move from global ambition into the implementation era that the Paris Agreement requires now, is that we're going to need to shift our focus to the local level as well. No implementation will ever happen without local communities and the local stakeholders involved in that implementation. And that gives me hope.
Is that what you mean by reinvention?
A little bit. I think that reinvention can be throughout the process. Of course, I think there's a natural trend as we shift gears in the Paris Agreement. But also, if we look at the Rio Conventions, for instance, they came out of 1992. They're 33 years old, like me. The world has changed dramatically in this last 3 decades. So for me, it's not necessarily surprising nor a bad thing that we need to rethink that global process. Of course, we can't throw away 3 decades of collaboration and the format of the COP and what they have brought to the world. And I think it's very important to shout this on the rooftops, but we hear a lot of criticism of the Paris Agreement, and don't get me wrong, of course, it's not going fast enough, it's not doing enough. But before 2015, the world was on a trajectory of plus 4 to 6 degrees. Thanks to the Paris Agreement, we are now on a trajectory of 2.5 to 2.9 degrees. It is still far from the goal that we have set for ourselves with 1.5, but it's still much, much better than where we started out. So that's where I see the interest in, learning our lessons and extracting the best of what we have with this international cooperation system that the COPs and the international conventions in general, and make them evolve in a sense that is definitely more inclusive, but also fit for purpose. It's a little bit like the criticism that is made to the United Nations. Whenever a global phenomenon, whether it's a environmental catastrophe or a war or any type of conflict that arises, everyone turns to the UN and say they're doing nothing. And then they're just saying that it's useless. But then why do you keep asking for the UN to do something about it? But if you think about it from a mandate perspective, the United Nations were created to uphold peace, which is a very, very different mandate than solving conflict. If you just look at it from a law perspective, it's not the same mandate, which means they're not equipped with the same tools. And that is why they're not fit for resolving conflicts. It's a lot of the same in international negotiations. And of course, it's a very heavy machinery that is in place, but it is not a useless one. And I think that's my main message. It is serving a purpose. It needs to be reinvented to some extent, because it needs to be more inclusive and more fit for purpose in terms of delivering concrete actions a lot faster. But the other thing that, and people are going to think I'm completely crazy and completely hopeful, but trust me, I also have my load of frustrations with the COP systems. But we know that, of course, the global geopolitical context is extremely difficult at the moment. And this transpired in the negotiations, obviously. And the countries that you would expect to block the negotiations did. But that's not a surprise. And, a lot of countries or individuals will point to Russia and Saudi Arabia. And yes, they are blocking the negotiations. But not that long ago, Brazil was part of that group of countries that were blocking the negotiations. And today, they demonstrated amazing leadership, diplomatic skills to drive the negotiations, to solve the internal conflicts. And they did, honestly, everything they could, given the hand that they had, really. And that gives me hope in a sense that it brings to light the limits of the multilateral process at the moment in such a striking way that my hope is that we can't ignore it anymore. And that, therefore, that gives me a lot of, I find it extremely exciting to be at a time where chaos is all around, but everything else can be built. You know, everything else can be reinvented and recreated with the core values, the fundamental values that we would like to see forward. And I talk about social justice, talk about knowledge, and all of these fairly naive values of life that ultimately we haven't been able to uphold until now. So how do we transform that? And for instance, one of the big controversies out of COP30 was fossil fuels not being included in the final text. Well, first of all, phasing out from fossil fuel was included at COP28, and we can't go back on decisions that we have made. And of course, it's not very surprising that it's not. COP30 is disappointing, but it's not surprising. But what came out of this, what we would have seen as a dead end, is coalitions of the willing. And you have other countries that want to phase out from fossil fuel and have decided to ignore or at least work without the ones that block to define that roadmap to phase out from fossil fuel. And that is a very powerful move. If you're a skeptic, you would tell me, yes, but we need the US, we need China on board. Of course we do. But with the tools that we have, we can't force their hands. The only things that we can do is be the first movers, show and lead by example, and then continue that diplomatic work to make sure that they don't completely drop out of the multilateral process.
And there are quite a lot of points that I would love to get into. At some point, I also want to get to the oceans, but I find this quite fascinating because I've only really gotten in touch with the UN processes to the plastic treaty, which I follow quite closely. And I'm also surprised by how many small countries actually lead and don't give in. And it's usually also those that are most affected by pollution that says, guys, this is not possible. We can't continue like that. And at the same time, I'm also, as an observer, like I'm not an official observer, but as a civil observer of that treaty process, I'm a bit frustrated by how it works. Are there concrete things that you think need to be reinvented within how these systems work? If you could redesign it, what are some of the things that you would change?
Well, hopefully there's some of the things that I'll get more time to think about with colleagues, because I don't think that one person or one group of individuals can solve it. It's a collaborative effort. One thing that I would love to see redefine the way that we work at the international level is the way we provide space for constructive dialogue and the inclusion of civil society in these conversations. And civil society is a very wide term. It goes from obviously NGOs and foundations, scientific institutions, to businesses, even cities, and of course local communities. So there's a wide range of stakeholders that are as involved by the conversations that may not necessarily find their way through this negotiations. And of course, the UN-led negotiations are what we call party-driven processes, which means that countries are the ones deciding, they're the ones leading the negotiations, and us as official observers, we are sometimes invited into the room and most of the time not. So that's one of the things that I would like to see in the future is a better dialogue across the different interests, but also the different groups. We have started already to design this space for more concrete dialogue, more ambition, and more solutions. Actually, the Climate Convention is a pioneer in that sense, because since 2016, so 1 year after the Paris Agreement, they've established a mandate for what they call the Marrakesh Partnership for Global Climate Action. One other thing that the UN needs to do is make sexier branding, because whenever we have to say Marrakesh Partnership, it's a mouthful, and it doesn't, the name is not always compelling. However, it also shows the leadership of Morocco at that time, making sure that there was space for civil society. And since then, it has become a growing part of the COPs, in my opinion, the beating heart of the COPs, because that's the dedicated space. And that in itself is quite extraordinary. Within the UN system, within the Climate Convention, we, as civil society, have a dedicated official space to exist within that conversation, which gives us a more direct line to countries, of course, but also organizes us across our different themes and interests, from land use to transport or energy, and of course, nature with forest and ocean. It gives us a space to convene, to have that dialogue, and most importantly, to design the solutions, to design the narrative in the way that is not necessarily constrained by the negotiations. And that's one of the most positive outcomes of COP30 that was highlighted in many closing remarks, including by the president of COP30, the role of society as a driving force for solutions, for implementation, has finally been recognized, which gives us a little bit of wiggle room to push for more recognition as well of the work that is being developed. Because having spent the last decade in every single climate COP, a big chunk of the biodiversity COPs, we do see two worlds happening in parallel tracks. How do we make sure that we connect the dots a little bit better? And the ocean, in that sense, is a great connector. It can be a blue thread across the different conventions that deal with climate or biodiversity. That is true because, first, ocean governance is extremely fragmented. So we need to exist in different areas, but we can help build those bridges, build those synergies between the decarbonization pathways that we need to establish. But that cannot happen without being biodiversity positive. How do we make sure that we don't solve a problem by creating an even bigger one, which, if we look back at history, human beings are wonderful at doing. But making sure that, and that goes back to what we were saying at the beginning in terms of that planetary approach. And that is actually quite recent, even in literature and academia, the understanding of the ecosystems and the connections between all living beings on Earth is fairly new. It's fairly recent in our understanding of our planetary systems. And that has actually translated into international negotiations. It's just that I feel as well that, especially the most recent generations, we're very impatient. Don't get me wrong, patience is not one of my strong suits. But it's also due to being bombarded by information all the time. It creates both a feeling of anxiety that I think all of us that are involved in these conversations are feeling, of course, but also it's very overwhelming. You don't really know where you can find your place in this big chaos, and how you can maybe find your purpose and how to help and contribute. And that's why the idea of changing the narrative is so important. Of course, we can't ignore the alarms from the scientific community, and whether it's the IPCC or IPBES or many other epistemic communities, they're crystal clear. We are not on track to achieve global goals. In terms of climate, nature, or sustainability agendas, we are not on track. We're not there. We do have 5 years left, but turning the tide in those last 5 years, or next 5 years, will require a lot of political courage, which has become a scarce resource in this day and age. So how do we make sure that we can be part of that conversation? We can be part of this new era of implementation. That's also by, showing and doing and trying to work with the stakeholders that are willing to make that transition and make that change. And we do see a lot of new, or not that new actually, because we need to stop reinventing the wheel as well and focus on what has already been announced. But there's a lot of ongoing initiatives that are groundbreaking in terms of the allies they're bringing around the table and the way that they address a set of issues. And here I'm thinking, for instance, about the mangrove breakthrough. If you first look at the mangrove breakthrough, you think about an initiative that is trying to protect 15 million hectares of mangroves by 2030, 2050. But if you look at the design of the initiative, they're not doing conservation. They're working with conservationists. They're working with countries and stakeholders on the ground that are doing the legwork. But they're redesigning the financing landscape to make the business case for nature. And it's a very different job. It's being at the interface between policy and decision making, conservation, and finance through mechanisms that bring everyone to the table as well and develops the right tools and guidelines and innovative thinking to ensure leadership. And we're seeing a lot more of this emerging from the climate conversations as well. With the ocean community, we have launched a few years ago for COP28 the ocean breakthroughs. And the idea was to identify those ocean-based sectors that have the highest impact, positive impact, of course, for climate, nature, and people. And by looking at tourism, shipping, energy, aquatic food, and of course, marine conservation, we have a portfolio of solutions that can genuinely help us achieve those goals of decarbonization and safeguarding nature while designing a livable future, relying on the blue economy. We have worked with scientists, economists, local communities, not enough, but we are definitely in the process of making this a lot better, and we're trying. But when I was telling you that international processes are not necessarily fit for some dialogues, this is one of them. And inclusivity needs to be strengthened in all aspects of the work. But we have worked on these targets that are based on scientific evidence. We have not reinvented the wheel. We've just collected the data, put it together, and set targets for ourselves to identify positive tipping points by 2030 in each of these different sectors to get to net zero by 2050. We have the lighthouse. Now what we need is leadership and concrete ways of translating this ambition into on-the-ground action. And that only happens by working with the right stakeholders. So for instance, when we talk about working on offshore wind, we're working with Ørsted, which is a company developing offshore renewable energy. But we're also working with Ocean Conservancy, which is a leading NGO in that field, as well as with the Global Offshore Wind Alliance, which is a coalition of countries that have committed to deploying and scaling offshore renewable energy in their national strategies. So it's reinventing these coalitions to fast track ambition, but also fast track the materialization of these great ideas.
Yeah. And I want to come back to that thought of this blue thread that the ocean is across all these. Like we have the biodiversity COP, we have the obviously Paris Agreement COP, or for the climate. We unfortunately don't have one for plastic yet, but again, everything in the end meets in the middle with the ocean. And you mentioned earlier that the ocean is too often portrayed as a victim, basically this thing that's just rising because the planet is getting hotter and hotter. But you say that it's actually also a solution. Is it only a solution as a convening point, or how else do you think the ocean is an ally or an ally for us in climate change and in all these big conversations we have?
Well, I see the ocean as a convener for sure, because of the diversity of voices that are impacted, are living, that are striving thanks to the ocean. But it's also a way to have conversations that are, we're a fairly consensual topic at the moment. Maybe that's because we've been in the margins of many conversations that have been dominated by terrestrial aspects, maybe. But we're a fairly consensual topic in a very, very disruptive world. So that allows for different voices, again, to be present in the ocean space and to express themselves in the ocean space where they couldn't necessarily in others. But the reality of it, if we focus on ocean and climate, on the ocean and climate nexus, for instance, is that we need to be more ambitious. We need to be more present, more powerful. But we also need to recognize that in the last decade, slowly but surely, we have made significant progress. And when we're always a bit torn with the headline of our article post COPs. And of course, it's always a bit mitigated, frustrations, progress, where do we stand? But ultimately, in the last decade, there was maybe nothing profoundly transformative about the ocean in the climate conversation. But we have made our way through. And every year, despite other political contexts, besides other setbacks, the ocean has always managed to scrap a little win. And we have also gained some very important wins in the last decades. We started with nothing really addressing the ocean in the climate convention to having a dedicated dialogue on ocean and climate. That happens every year.
Actually, this is one point that I find super interesting. How on earth is it possible that the ecosystem that is responsible for storing, I think, 90% of human-generated heat, produces 50% of the oxygen, absorbs, what is it, I think 25% of CO2 or 30%. How was that not part of the climate conversation, and what brought it on the table?
I know, it's striking, isn't it? But yeah, for 21 years, the ocean was largely ignored from the climate conversation. It wasn't completely absent. And when you talk to policy nerds, such as myself, they will tell you that in the UNFCCC conventions, there are some hints to the ocean, including to the impacts, indeed, of climate change on the ocean. But of course, the Paris Agreement was a turning point for the ocean and for the climate conversations, because what happened before was not exactly successful, right? And I think that there was both a misunderstanding or a lack of understanding, it's not a misunderstanding, it's a lack of understanding about the role of the ocean as a mitigator, as the thermostat of our planet, as you said, that was largely ignored. And what happened not only at COP21 and after is unprecedented mobilization from non-state actors and from civil society, together with scientists. And in that sense, COP21 in Paris was a game changer, and that was the very reason why the Ocean and Climate Platform was created, is to bring stakeholders together to advocate for the role of the ocean in climate mitigation, in the climate system in general, really. And by working with the COP21 presidency, with the French government, but also with other coalitions of states, we managed to get our narrative out there. And here I want to highlight that it's a lot of what we've said in the last few minutes, but everyone has a role to play. So with the Ocean and Climate Platform, we convened non-state actors. Through the Because the Ocean initiative, more than 20 countries, led by Monaco and Chile, and Fiji, the Pacific Island nations, were absolutely a game changer in getting not only the ocean recognized, but quite frankly, getting that level of ambition in the Paris Agreement. That was the small island developing states. But with these different coalitions of stakeholders, we managed to break down the door of the climate negotiations to be elevated, to be understood, to be there. And it's working with the negotiators and with the countries directly that got us the word ocean in the preamble of the Paris Agreement. That was the beginning. And since then, it's the structuration, I would say, of our community in terms of key messages, of policy asks, but also taking the time to understand and identify the landscape or seascape in which we're evolving, to see where we're most influential and to see where we would be most relevant. And what was decided is that since the ocean is so cross-cutting to the different issues of the climate fora, from mitigation to adaptation to implementation, but also any scientific body, is that we need to be represented in these different agenda items, making sure that we're well embedded in that conversation, and to the point earlier made, that we're relevant. It means that we had to shape our narrative in a language that is accessible to the climate convention. And one of the, let's say, milestones of the last decade was in 2019 for the first Blue COP that was held in Madrid, but under Chilean presidency, where the leadership of the Chilean government in labeling the COP25 as a Blue COP to elevate the role of the ocean opened many doors in the implementation of the Paris Agreement, with the first narrative about how ocean-based measures, how these ocean solutions can be included in national strategies that emerged then, and since then has taken off quite well. But it's also then that we had our first grand entrance of the ocean in a final COP decision, which is the 2-3 pager that comes out, the declaration, the political declaration that comes out after 2 weeks of negotiations. And you were saying that, it took 20 years to actually talk about the ocean and the climate forum. It took 25 years to get it into the core decisions. But with that, we have secured an annual space between COP25 and COP26 for the ocean and climate conversation, So we have this annual dialogue that takes place in Bonn during the intersession, the midway between each COP. And we have a formal mandate, which seems like nothing, but it's, we need to play by the rules. So a mandate is what we need to be influential in the climate negotiations. And we have an official mandate from Glasgow, from COP26, to strengthen the ocean climate nexus in all relevant process and mechanisms of the UNFCCC,
Mm.
which means that now we have the right tools at our display, and we need to know how to best navigate them to make sure that the ocean is being discussed. And to give you an example, because finance has, of course, been at the top of everyone's agenda in the
It's
last
always
few
about the
years,
money.
it's always about the money. It's
Yeah.
the crux of the issue. So next year, the Standing Committee on Finance will focus on water and ocean systems. That has never happened before. That is extremely important in the sense that it's not just ocean lovers preaching to the choir. We're breaking out of our blue bubble. We're making sure through the Standing Committee on Finance, which deals with all of the other issues being addressed under the Paris Agreement, that ocean is part of that conversation. We spent a decade making sure that ocean action is climate action. The only way that translates is if ocean finance is part of the climate finance. Because having a portfolio of solutions, having a narrative about the role of the ocean in the climate system, in sustaining livelihoods and life on Earth, is nothing if we do not have the money to make sure that all of these solutions can be implemented, especially in developing countries.
No. That's the place where I want to go next. The implementation, actually. But maybe we start with the core policy asks for the ocean. What do you think needs to, or what are the core policy asks when it comes to the ocean?
The core policy ask, I mean, there are manifold, but they're also very technical, so I don't know how exciting it can be, but
Maybe there's like headlines or categories.
I think that, one of them is, as I was just mentioning, is anchoring the ocean into the finance roadmap, or the finance outcomes of the climate discussions, is identifying how the different ocean-based climate solutions can be funded through the mechanisms such as the Global Environmental Facility or the Green Climate Fund or any other finance bodies. That's definitely a core ask, and that will be paramount to deliver on the implementation. I think we also need more political leadership in terms of bringing that technicality that is necessary, that we're working on with the negotiators, with the UNFCCC Secretariat, in better understanding how to move the needle forwards. All of these technical conversations need to be elevated during the COPs with ministerial conversations, if not heads of state conversations about the ocean and the climate. I think that's something that was fairly successful at COP30 this year. It's not something that happens every year, so that's why we're so excited about COP30. In the World Leaders Summit, where the heads of state come, the ocean was very well represented. The COP30 special envoy for the ocean was the only of the 30 special envoys, I believe, to take the floor in front of all of these important people to talk about the relevance of the ocean climate conversation. There was an entire roundtable chaired by President Lula about nature. And in nature, we had forest, of course, and we know how important the forest conversation was for Brazil. But they also elevated the conversation about the ocean to truly embrace the planetary approach. And if we're talking about one lung of the planet, then we need to talk about the other one as well. And having this conversation elevated in the COPs through the World Leader Summit or through ministerial roundtables, which we organized as well during the second week of COP. We had a dedicated roundtable with ministers to talk about how concretely countries across the globe from different regions can implement the different ocean-based climate solutions. And if I'm being completely honest, I have done my fair share of roundtables with ministers in the last decade. And I was actually very positively surprised with this one because we didn't spend an hour and a half listening to a number of remarks from countries laying out state-of-the-art latest findings on the ocean and how much of a threat climate change is. We dove straight into the solutions. And all of the dirty words, including phasing out offshore oil and gas, were mentioned. They were part of the conversation. They were bluntly expressed as part of the way to turn back the tide and get ourselves back on track, if we can, towards a 1.5 degree target. And I found that, I mean, it was a very, a nutshell of leadership that I hadn't seen in a long time. So that was energizing. And I think that, you know, it is part of, we need to compose with the different tools. And one of them is the political leadership. And as we mentioned, the ocean is fairly consensual at the moment. So it's easy for a head of state or a minister to come and talk about the ocean. We need to make sure that we don't just provide a space for parading, but make sure that we take stock and we track progress. And I think that's one of the most important asks that we have in the ocean community, but much more broadly, is about accountability. There are so many conferences, there are so many what I call glitter moments, where we have, you know, big new announcements and we get the journalists and we get the famous people in the room, and then we don't really know what happens. What we've observed over the years as well is that a lot of these commitments are being recycled from one conference to the next. So we're all for recycling, but not when it comes to making big announcements, including about funding ocean solutions. You know, if you announce the same 2 millions or 20 or 200 millions in 4 different spaces, you don't have 4 times the same amount of money. You have the same amount of money. So we need to make sure that we develop the right mechanisms in monitoring and reporting to make sure that we know where the money goes, obviously, but we also know the progress that is being made, or lack thereof, in developing and implementing all of these initiatives that have been announced over the last few years. And here again, COP30 has made tremendous progress by launching the granary of solutions that brings together all of the different solutions that have been developed. And I mean, it can still be populated, obviously, but it gives you a good snapshot of what exists. And with a platform that is intended to assess those progress, because the ocean community is always more ambitious and a little bit ahead of the game. We have launched our own Ocean Breakthroughs dashboard, which already has the data and compiles all of that data across the 5 sectors that I was mentioning, from shipping to conservation, and provides real data that you can use to better understand where we're at, and understand that it's not a binary response. It's not we have failed or we have succeeded. No, it's where do we stand on the targets that we have set for ourselves. And I think that is also part of the revolution that we need in terms of the next steps and the main policy asks for the ocean climate dynamic and the climate dynamic in general. is having that honest, robust accountability across sectors, across stakeholders. That will be invaluable to make sure that we go back, stay. We've never really been on track, so find our track that will make a livable future.
No? And maybe as a closing topic, talking about solutions. To me personally, if you think about life and all its purpose, and if you have more of an existentialist worldview, you come to the conclusion that in the end, nothing really matters, right? It's like if the climate changes, it changes. At some point, we will be dead. The sun explodes, we're all gone. And for me, this was a major insight into going into the ocean and into the plastic space, because I said, for me personally, in the end, being on the planet should be as much of a good time as I can have. I personally have a great time by the ocean. I want future generations to enjoy that ecosystem, no matter where they come from. I always thought, in the end, everybody has a better life on a cleaner planet, on a healthier planet. And sometimes I wonder why not more people understand that. But and that's for me the solution that we're working towards. But what are the concrete, or are there concrete stories that you can share of progress? I think there's tremendous breakthroughs, obviously, on the policy level, that the ocean is part of the conversation at all. This is probably the biggest thing that could be there, because this is where the future of the planet is being decided. However, sometimes when things happen on a policy level, it's just not that exciting, right? People do get emotional when they see, oh my God, there's this new mangrove tree growing. There's a few little fish that found shelter again. Like this can do something more on an emotional level than a policy paper. What are you seeing around the world that gives you hope when it comes to implementation?
First, to your comment about more people realizing the importance of safeguarding our planet, I agree. And when sometimes I explain the work that I do, people are like, "Oh wow, you're saving the planet." Not at all. Not saving the planet. The planet is going to do very, very well without us. I'm trying to save ourselves. It's a very selfish thing to do. It's trying to make sure that human life as we know it can try and prosper a little bit. So no, we're not saving the planet. We're a very dark spot in a very long history, and very short. So I agree. I mean, if our time comes, planet will be fine. But yeah, so that's maybe one cynical way of approaching it for other people to get on board with trying to advance the ocean climate biodiversity agenda. But what gives me hope in more of the grassroots or on the ground projects, I think that, well, first of all, I'm a diver. So I do also find a lot of comfort close to the ocean, but also under the ocean, and being able to witness thriving ecosystem, thriving life in coral reefs. That gives me hope. It gives me despair when I see that coral is bleaching and that some areas of the world are losing biodiversity at a rate that is unprecedented. But there is also great work out there, and I'll conclude on this, because one of the initiatives or projects that I love the most is one that I'm heading towards in a couple of months. I'm very excited. It's called the Sea People, or Orang Laut in Indonesian. It's a grassroots organization that was launched in the Raja Ampat, which is one of the most beautiful diving spots in the world. So I encourage you to go there. But it's also the Coral Triangle. And it's an area where coral restoration is very encouraging, where megafauna and marine biodiversity is still quite pristine. And this organization, the Sea People, it's been launched by marine biologists, working with local communities on protecting this pristine environment. And what I love about the way they're working is that, first of all, they started doing coral restoration because of a very simple story. Originally, they were divers having the times of their life. And they came across this reef that was that was completely damaged, destroyed by an impact with a boat, and both crashed into the reef or something like that. And a few years later, 2 or 3 years later, they had completely forgot about this spot, and they went back and like, oh, okay, maybe we should go dive there and see what happened with the reef. And they were completely surprised and amazed at the rate at which coral had grown back in that specific spot. They're not pretending that they're going to replant and restore coral reefs all over the world. Not at all. They're looking at their backyards and the backyards of the local communities living there. And they saw some conditions that were favorable to coral reefs growing back. And they have decided to work with former fishermen, because dynamite fishing and cyanide fishing are still practices that take place in these areas. So they've decided to reform these fishermen and train them as coral gardeners, and make sure that they would have sustainable livelihoods as divers, but also being members of the NGO, contributing to restoring that fauna and flora. And what has been amazing is that they have developed a whole ecosystem on land as well, because they're working very closely with the local communities, with the villages and the children in the area where they're based, making sure that there was an understanding of their own backyard. So their understanding of their ecosystem, of their resources, and making sure that it could enjoy these ecosystems for the decades to come. And building on this, because this is a remarkable space for many landmark species around the globe, they've also developed a number of tools, including apps, to ease the tracking of megafauna. And for instance, in the national park of the Rat Giant Pot, they've been working with the local authorities to demonstrate that tourism needed to be regulated, because in some of the areas known for large numbers of manta rays, they could see, because they had trained so many people to be divers, they could show an enormous amount of data in a very short amount of time. That the population of mantas was declining in these specific spots that was not regulated, and there were too many boats, and there were too many divers, and they managed to work with the local authorities to change the regulation and get it actually regulated, and the mantas are coming back, and everyone can enjoy it in a sustainable manner.
Yeah.
And that gives me so much hope, because it took few people, maybe it started with 2 and there may be 20 now. It's so few people that made some very concrete change that are contributing to safeguarding one of the most beautiful places on earth. And they just did it by doing what they love, which I think is a great lesson for us all, but also by showcasing, demonstrating the point of case. And I think that's beautiful. And I think that these initiatives that take place at the local level need to be brought to the global level as well. Not only to show hope, which we need, but also to explain what it looks like to make progress, and how significant reorganizing our international cacophony and getting the money where it's most needed can go a really, really long way.
No, it's beautiful. Manta rays are my favorite sea animal. I once got the chance to snorkel with them in Hawaii, and it was absolutely mind-blowing. I think I've never seen anything more beautiful than that. So I'm very happy that they are protected. And I think I need to talk to more people from Raja Ampat, because I hear great stories from there. The Reshark project is there, and so
Very
many
happy
good
to put you in
initiatives.
touch with them, because
Yeah, I
there
hope
is
that I can speak with them from the Sea People. And I think you more than deserved going there after spending 10 years at these, or more than 10 years at these conferences, and fighting for the ocean on a policy level, I think in a way that very few people in the world would want to. So thank you very much for everything that you did for the ocean so far. And I'm very happy for you that you get to enjoy them now a bit as well.
Thank you very much. And all of it was a collaborative efforts, but I do believe in,
Sure.
taking the
Yeah.
right amount of time to,
Yeah.
take a step back and come back with even more ideas and be even more
Yeah.
disruptive to make sure that, we do safeguard our blue planet.
It's not
Thank
the
you
end
so
of the
much.
journey.
Definitely not.